Hello, and welcome to another teaching from 2536. Today we're going to explore the Moses seat, the place where the decrees and laws were administered. Let's begin by taking a look at what Moses himself proclaimed from the Moses seat. Now Israel, hear the decrees and laws I'm about to teach you. Follow them, so that you may live, and may go in and take possession of the land the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. Do not add to what I command you, and do not subtract from it, but keep the commands of the Lord your God that I give you. So when and where did all this take place? This all took place on the third day at Mount Sinai, as we read in Exodus 24. When Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." So now that we know when and where this all took place, let's continue in Deuteronomy 4, picking up in verse 5, to learn why these decrees and laws were given in the first place. See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear all about these decrees and say, "Surely this nation is a wise and understanding people." What other nation is so great as to have their God near them the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today? So imagine having decrees and laws so good that other nations would be jealous of them. But now imagine how jealous that nation would be if their decrees and laws were taken away from them and given to another nation, who practice them in the Spirit and in truth. And this is what Paul is trying to communicate in his letter to the Romans when he wrote, "I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles." Okay, so let's go back to Deuteronomy 4, picking up now in verse 11. "You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while it blazed with fire to the very heavens, with black clouds and deep darkness. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. He declared to you his covenant, the 10 Commandments, which he commanded you to follow, and then wrote them on 2 stone tablets. And, because your fathers rejected them, which is the stone the builders rejected event, the Lord directed me at that time to teach you the decrees and laws you are to follow in the land that you are crossing over the Jordan to possess." Okay, so let's put the Moses seat in context. In today's terms, this would be the county seat, or the county courthouse, a place where the county's business is transacted, but it's also where the district and county courts are held, also known as the bench. Black's Law Dictionary defines the bench as the seat of judgment for the administration of justice. This is the seat that's occupied by the judge or judges. In other words, the county seat is where all the decrees and laws are administered, which should help bring some understanding to what Christ meant when he said, "The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." So to gain the proper context of why Christ said this, we need to go back to Exodus. The next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge, while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered him, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties to inform them of God's decrees and instructions." So Moses' father-in-law suggests that Moses select some capable men from the people, men who fear the Father, are trustworthy, and hate dishonest gain. Then he should appoint them as officials over the people in order to lighten his load. So from that time on, the people would go to the scribes and Pharisees for their rulings and to inquire about the Father, which is why Christ says, "Whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do." And what was it that the scribes and Pharisees were telling the children of Israel to observe and do? They were telling them to observe and do the Father's decrees and laws. Remember, the Father gave the full set to Moses when the people rejected the Father's covenant law and demanded another covenant, the law contained in ordinances. So when Christ said, "Do not do according to their works," for they say and do not do, he's referring to the 3 I do's that were said at Mount Sinai, but that they did not do. Let's explore this in more detail. The first I do came on their first day at Mount Sinai, when Moses received the message of the gospel, that if they hear and obey all that the Father says, they will be his treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. So when Moses shared the gospel message with the people, they all agreed to hear and obey all that comes from the voice of the Father, which was the Father's covenant law, the law of the Spirit of life. The second I do came on the 3rd day at Mount Sinai, when the people broke their promise to hear and obey and took a stand against the Father, and then vowed to hear and obey Moses instead. So Moses went alone to the top of the mountain to receive the law and righteous rulings from the voice of the Father. The third and final I do comes when they agree to hear and obey all that is written in the book of the law covenant. It's the book of the law covenant that Paul refers to in his letter to the Colossians as the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us. Paul writes this because it was the book of the law covenant that Moses ratified with the people, and it was ratified with the blood of bulls, not the blood of Christ, because it was a man's covenant. And this should help bring clarity to what Paul wrote in his letter to the Galatians, that the book of the law covenant was a man's covenant, but that covenant, even though it was ratified with blood, did not negate the promise made to Abraham and his seed, who is Christ. So we see 3 times the children of Israel said that they would do, but didn't. Their first I do was their promise to obey the law of the Spirit of life. Their second and third I do's were their promises to obey the law of sin and death. The law the children of Israel demanded and received on the 3rd day at Mount Sinai, when they took their stand against the Father and demanded another gospel, which was ratified in Exodus 24. So even after the Father gave them the desire of their heart, they still didn't do what they promised they would do. Instead, they adopted the way of the Canaanites. And this is what Christ was pointing to. Christ was equating the mission of the scribes and Pharisees to that of the Canaanites, which was to steal, kill, and destroy the seed, just as they did on the 3rd day at Mount Sinai. So yes, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat all right, but they surely didn't receive the gospel message Moses shared with the children of Israel. Moses told them to choose life, meaning the law of the Spirit of life. Instead, they remained steadfast in their keeping of the law of sin and death, and sought to bind everyone they could to it. In other words, they were not using the law properly. And we see the same thing continue today. People go to their pastors, priests, rabbis, and teachers to get their rulings or to inquire about the Father. And just like the scribes and Pharisees before them, the enemy uses them for the same mission, to steal, kill, and destroy the seed, because without the seed, we're unable to hear and obey the Father. And they do it in the same way the scribes and Pharisees did, by offering another gospel, a gospel that lacks the word that came from the Father, a gospel that's powerless and impotent in all aspects having to do with all the people on the earth to be blessed. Why? Because the word that comes from man is powerless. It's powerless because it's void of the Spirit that gives life. For what the law, meaning the book of the law covenant, was powerless to do, why? Because it was weakened by the flesh. God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. And so he condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fully met in us, who do not live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. And here's the thing, the law is spiritual, which means it must be understood and followed through the Spirit, not through our flesh, meaning our own understanding and the works of our hands. Those who lack the Spirit follow the written code as their way of righteousness, which is legalism. The legalist follows the letter of the law through the circumcision of their flesh and the works of their hands. As a result, they cast the shadow and the image of a Pharisee, which looks a lot like pride, self-righteousness, and judgment, and then they cast that judgment over all those who don't follow the law in the same way that they do. But this is bad fruit because it comes from a bad tree. This is building our faith in our own faithfulness to perform our religious rituals and traditions, which is really idolatry. Idolatry is materializing the spiritual by covering it with rituals and traditions, and then observing these rituals and traditions as worship. Now let's go back to Deuteronomy to understand why they do this. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. So the obvious question here is, why? Why is the Father going to raise up another prophet? For this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb, on the day of the assembly, when you said, Let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire any more, or we will die. The Lord said to me, What they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you, from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. And this is what Paul is trying to explain in his letter to the Galatians, when he wrote, So the law is our guardian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. Now that this faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. Of course, this means we must hear and obey the prophet, who is the Messiah, the Christ, the Word that came from the Father, who called us to repentance, onto the covenant of promise, the way in which all the families of the earth will be blessed. And if we keep reading in Deuteronomy, we'll see that all those who do not hear and obey the word that comes from the Father, they will die according to the terms and conditions of the covenant they demanded, the book of the law, which contains the curse of the law. Now let's take a look at the context for why Christ said that the scribes and Pharisees tie up heavy, cumbersome loads on the shoulders of the people, which all has to do with, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. This passage is all about those who go to the scribes and Pharisees to settle their disputes. The goal of the priest and pastor is to make sure your eyes and ears stay shut, so that you're not able to hear and obey the Father, but hear and obey them instead. They're making sure not to remove the heavy burden of their doctrines and dogma, or to put it back on as they tried to do with these new believers in Galatia. And what was it that the scribes and Pharisees missed? They missed the very same thing that the foolish virgins of our time will miss. So let's explore this in a little detail. After giving the ultimate gospel message to the second generation, Moses says, I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Therefore, choose life, that both you and your descendants may live, that you may love the Lord your God, and that you may obey his voice, and that you may cling to him, not Moses. For he is your life and the length of your days, and that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. This is why Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Christ is the seed that was cast out at Mount Sinai. He is the word that came from the Father, and that word is the life Moses is telling the people to receive. Christ is the prophet Moses pleaded with the people to hear and obey. And when the prophet Moses foretold about finally came, the Father himself told us to listen to him. And what were Christ's final instructions just before he returned to the Father? And he said to them, Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Now notice he didn't say any gospel. He said to preach the gospel, the good news. Not just any gospel or any good news. And since there is only one who is good, the Father, then the good news must come from him. And this really highlights the cunning of the enemy, who has snuck in and confused the ignorant and unstable to accept and share another gospel, which is really no gospel at all because it lacks the power to save. Christ himself shares the consequences of what happens and why it's important that we present the true gospel. Whoever believes in him, who is the light of the world, the seed cast out at Mount Sinai, the word that came from the Father's voice, the gospel, the law of the Spirit of life, is not condemned. But whomever does not believe stands condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness. They reject the light, the seed cast out, the gospel, and have accepted another gospel, the word that comes from the voice of man, whether that's Moses, your priest, or your pastor, instead of the light, because their deeds are evil. For everyone who does evil, meaning those who practice lawlessness, hate the light, and will not come into the light, for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth, meaning those who practice the law of the Spirit of life, come into the light, so that they may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. In other words, those who come to the light will be set free from having to carry around the heavy burden of the terms and conditions of the curse of the law, which are the consequences for transgressing the law of the Spirit of life. But those who do not believe, well, they will be condemned. And this just begs the question, what law are we legally bound to, And are we proclaiming and discipling unto others? Is it the stone that the builders rejected on the third day at Mount Sinai, the word that came from the Father? Or is it the one that becomes a millstone around our neck, the word that comes from man? Well, we hope this teaching has been helpful in understanding the Moses seat. May you be blessed in your pursuit of truth. Shalom.